Section 2, Sutra 5. Hi, welcome back. Anitya Shuchi Dukkha Natmatsu Nitya Suchi Shuchi Sukatma Kyatir Avidya. Anitya Shuchi Dukkha Natmasu Nitya Shuchi Sukatma Kyatir Avidya. I think that's right. And I just want to say again, clearly I struggle through these words. I'm not an expert in Sanskrit. I sound it out. Clearly I struggle with these. All right. Of non-eternal, impure, misery, pain, evil, and non-atman, not self, eternal, pure, happiness, pleasure, good, self, knowledge, consciousness, taking, ignorance. Avidya is taking the non-eternal, impure, evil, and non-atman to be eternal, pure, good, and atman, respectively. This sutra defines avidya, the root of the kleshas. It is quite obvious that the word avidya is not used in its ordinary sense of ignorance or lack of knowledge, but in its highest philosophical sense. In order to grasp this meaning of the word, we have to recall the initial process whereby, according to the yogic philosophy, consciousness, the reality with a capital R, underlying manifestation, becomes involved in matter. Consciousness and matter are separate and utterly different in their essential nature, but for reasons which will be discussed in the subsequent sutras, they have to be brought together. How can Atma, which is eternally free and self-sufficient, be made to assume the limitations which are involved in the association with matter? It is by depriving it of the knowledge, or rather the awareness, of its eternal and self-sufficient nature. This deprivation of knowledge of its true nature, which involves it in the evolutionary cycle, is brought about by a transcendent power inherent in the ultimate reality, which is called Maya, or the great illusion. Of course, this simple statement of a transcendent truth can give rise to innumerable philosophical questions, such as, why should it be necessary for the Atma, which is self-sufficient, to be involved in matter? How is it possible for the Atma, which is eternal, to become involved in the limitations of time and space? There is no real answer to such ultimate questions, although many answers, obviously absurd, have been suggested by different philosophers from time to time. According to those who have come face to face with reality and know this secret, the only method by which this mystery can be unraveled is to know the truth, which underlies manifestation, and which by its very nature is incommunicable. Communicable, right, okay. As a result of the illusion in which consciousness gets involved, it begins to identify itself with matter, with which it becomes associated. This identification becomes increasingly fuller as consciousness descends further into matter until the turning point is reached and the upward climb in the opposite direction begins. So beautiful. The reverse process of evolution, in which consciousness gradually extricates itself, as it were, from matter, results in an increasing realization of its real nature and ends in complete self-realization in Kaivalya. Well, so yes and no, because they're saying it actually doesn't end in Kaivalya because there are rungs that are higher. But I guess for the purposes of this sutra, that's what they mean. It is this fundamental privation of knowledge of its real nature, which begins with the evolutionary cycle, is brought about by the power of Maya, and ends with the attainment of liberation in Kaivalya, which is called Avidya. So it's the privation of knowledge is called Avidya. So Avidya, it's actually not, they're saying it's not ignorance, it's lack of knowledge, right? It's being divorced from or separated from knowledge. Avidya has nothing to do with the knowledge which we acquire through the intellect and which refers to the things concerning the phenomenal worlds. A man may be a great scholar, a walking encyclopedia, as we say, and yet may be so completely immersed in the illusions created by the mind that he may stand much below a simple-minded sadhaka who is particularly or partially aware of the great illusions of the intellect and the life in these phenomenal worlds. The avidya of the latter is much less than that of the former, in spite of the tremendous difference in knowledge pertaining to the intellect. This absence of awareness of our true nature results in the inability to distinguish between the eternal, pure, blissful self and the non-eternal, impure, and painful not self. The word eternal here means, as usual, the state of consciousness, which is above the limitation of time as we know it, as a succession of phenomenon. Pure refers to the purity of consciousness as it exists unaffected and unmodified by matter, which imposes upon it the limitation of the three gunas and consequent illusions. Blissful, of course, refers to the ananda or bliss of the Atma, which is inherent in it and which is independent of any external source or circumstance. The privation of this sukha or bliss, which is inevitable when consciousness is identified with matter, is dukkha or misery. All these three attributes, which have been mentioned in this distinction between the self and the not self, are merely illustrative and not exhaustive, because it is impossible to define the nature of the self and to distinguish it from the not self in terms of the limited conceptions of the intellect. The central idea to be grasped is that the Atma, in its purity, is fully conscious of its real nature. Progressive involution in matter deprives it of this self-knowledge in increasing degree, and it is the privation of this knowledge which is called Avidya. As the matter is one pertaining to the realities beyond the scope of the intellect, it is not possible to understand it through the medium of the intellect alone. Sutra 6. Drug darshana saktyur ekatma teva smita. Drug darshana shaktyur ekatma teva smita. Of power of consciousness, seer, purusha, and power of seeing, cognition, buddhi, identity blending together as if I amness. Asmitā is the identity or blending together, as it were, of the power of consciousness, purusha, with the power of cognition, buddhi. Asmitā is defined in this sutra as the identification of the power of consciousness with the power of cognition. But as the power of cognition always works through a vehicle in its wider and more intelligible meaning, it may be considered as the identification of consciousness with the vehicle through which it is being expressed. This is a very important and interesting idea, which we should understand thoroughly if we want to master the technique of liberating consciousness from the limitations under which it works in the ordinary individual. The Sanskrit word Asmitā is derived from asmi, which means literally, I am. I am represents the pure awareness of self-existence and is therefore the expression or bhava, as it is called, of pure consciousness or the purusha. When the pure consciousness gets involved in matter, and owing to the power of maya, knowledge of its real nature is lost, and the pure I am changes into I am this, where this may be the subtlest vehicle through which it is working, or the grossest vehicle, namely the physical body. And remember from before, they're saying that the subjective is always wider and more expanded than the objective. So when it starts to identify with this, it's contracting, right? Okay. The two processes, namely the loss of awareness of its real nature and the identification with the vehicles, are simultaneous. The moment consciousness identifies itself with its vehicles, it has fallen from its pure state, and it becomes bound by the limitations of Avidya, or we may say that the moment the veil of Avidya falls on consciousness, its identification with its vehicles results immediately, though philosophically, Avidya must precede Asmitā. So, ignorance causes identification with this. Identification with this does not cause Avidya, right? Okay. The involution of consciousness in matter is a progressive process, and for this reason, though Avidya and Asmita begin where the thinnest veil of Maya involves pure consciousness in the subtlest vehicle, the degree of Avidya and Asmita goes on increasing as the association of consciousness with matter becomes more and more strengthened. Okay. As consciousness descends into one vehicle after another, the veil of Avidya becomes, as it were, thicker, and the tendency to identify oneself with the vehicle becomes stronger and grosser. On the other hand, when the reverse process takes place and consciousness is released from its limitations in its evolutionary upward climb, the veil of Avidya becomes thinner and the resulting Asmita weaker and subtler. This evolution on the upward arc takes place in 7 definite and clearly marked stages, as is indicated in Sutra 27, Section 2. These stages correspond to the transference of consciousness from one vehicle to a subtler vehicle. Let us now come down from the abstract principles and consider the problem in relation to things with which we are familiar and which we can understand more easily. Let us consider the problem of the expression of consciousness through the physical body. We should remember, in considering this question, that the consciousness which is normally expressed through the physical body is not pure, unmodified consciousness being involved in a vehicle. It has already passed through several such involutions, and it is already heavily loaded, as it were, when it seeks expression through the outermost or grossest vehicle. It is therefore consciousness conditioned by the limitations of all the intervening vehicles, which form a kind of bridge between it and the physical body. But as the process of involution and consequent identification is in essence the same at each stage of involution, we can get some idea of the underlying principles, even though the expression of consciousness through the physical body is complicated by the factors referred to above. Coming back to our problem, we then see that the association of consciousness, conditioned as mentioned above, with the physical body must lead to this identification with the vehicle, and the language, which is used by all of us in common intercourse, reflects this fully. We also use such expressions as I see, I hear, I go, I sit. In the case of the savage and the child, this identification with the body is so complete that there is not the slightest feeling of discrepancy in using such language. But the educated and intelligent man, whose identification with the body is not quite complete, and who feels to a certain extent that he is different from the body, is aware, at least in a vague manner, that it is not he who sees, hears, walks, and sits. These activities belong to the physical body, and he is merely witnessing them through his mind. Still, from force of habit and disinclination to go deeper into the matter, or from fear of appearing odd in using the correct language, he continues to use the common phraseology. So deep-rooted is this identification that even physiologists, psychologists, and philosophers who are supposed to be familiar with the mechanism of sense perception and intellectually recognize the mere instrumentality of the physical body are hardly actively aware of this tendency and may identify themselves with the body completely. It is worth noting that mere intellectual knowledge with regard to such patent facts does not by itself enable a person to separate himself from his vehicles. Who has more detailed knowledge with regard to the physical body and its functions than a doctor who has dissected hundreds of bodies and knows that it is a mere mechanism? One would expect that a doctor, at least, from whom nothing inside the body is hidden, will be above this tendency to regard himself as the body. But is a doctor in any way better off in this respect than a layman? Not at all. This is not a matter of ordinary seeing and understanding at all. Asmitā, or identification with a vehicle, is not a simple but a very complex process and has many aspects. The first aspect we may consider is identification with the powers and faculties associated with the vehicles. For example, when a person says, "I see," what really happens is that the faculty of sight is exercised by the body through the eye, and the indwelling entity becomes merely aware of the result, for instance, the panorama presented before the eye. Again, when he says, "I walk," what really happens is that the will working through the mind moves the body on its legs like a portable instrument, and the indwelling entity identifies himself with the movement of the body and says, "I walk." The second aspect is the association of the subtler vehicle in this process of identification, where a compound asmitā, if such a phrase can be used, is produced. Thus, when a person says he has a headache, what is really happening is that there is a slight disorder in the brain. This disorder, by its reaction on the next subtler vehicle through which sensations and feelings are felt, produces the sensation of pain. The indwelling entity identifies himself with this joint product of these two vehicles, and this results in his having a headache, although a little thought will show him that it is not he, but the vehicle which is having the pain of which he is aware. The same thing working at a somewhat higher level produces such reactions as "I think," "I approve." It is the mind which thinks and approves, and the consciousness becomes merely aware of the thought process which is reflected in the physical body. Ambition, pride, and similar unpleasant traits of human character are merely highly developed and perverted forms of this tendency to identify ourselves with the workings of the mind. A third aspect, which may be considered in this process of identification, is the inclusion of other accessories and objects in the environment. The physical body becomes a center around which The physical body becomes a center round which get associated a number of objects which in smaller or greater degree become part of the I. These objects may be animate or inanimate. The other bodies which are born of one's body become my children. The house in which one's body is kept becomes my house. So round the umbra, total shadow, created by Asmitā with the body is a penumbra, partial shadow, containing all those objects and persons which belong to the I, working through the body, and they produce the attitude, or bhava, of my and mine. The above brief and general discussion of Asmitā associated with the physical body will give some idea to the student with regard to the nature of this klesha. Of course, Asmitā manifesting through the physical body is the grossest form of the klesha, and as we try to study the working of this tendency in subtler vehicles, we find it more and more elusive and difficult to deal with. Any thoughtful man can separate himself in thought from his physical body and see that he is not the bag of flesh, bones, and marrow, with the help of which he comes in contact with the physical world. But few can separate themselves from their intellect and realize that their opinions and ideas are mere thought patterns produced by their mind, just like the thought patterns produced by other minds. The reason why we take interest in and attach so much importance to our opinions lies, of course, in the fact that we identify ourselves with our intellect. Our thoughts, opinions, prejudices, and predilections are part of our mental possessions, children of our mind, and that is why we feel and show such undue and tender regard for them. Of course, there are levels of consciousness even beyond that of the intellect. In all these, Asmitā is present, though it becomes subtler and more refined as we leave one vehicle after another. It is no use dealing with these subtler manifestations of Asmitā here, because unless one can transcend the intellect and function in these super intellectual fields, one cannot really understand them. Although the question of destroying the kleshas will be dealt with later in subsequent sutras, there is one fact which may be usefully pointed out here. Many methods have been suggested whereby this tendency to identify ourselves with our vehicles may be gradually attenuated. Many of these methods are quite useful and do help us in a certain measure to disentangle our consciousness from our vehicles. But it has to be borne in mind that complete dissociation from a vehicle takes place only when consciousness is able to leave the vehicle deliberately and consciously and function in the next subtler vehicle, of course, with all the still subtler vehicles present in the background. When the Jivatma is able to leave a vehicle at will and see it separate from himself, then only is the false sense of identification completely destroyed. We may meditate for years trying to separate ourselves in thought from the body, but the result of this will not be as great as one experience of leaving it consciously and seeing it actually separate from ourselves. We shall, of course, re-enter that body and assume all its limitations, but it can never again exercise on us the same illusory influence as it did before. We have realized that we are different from the body. For the advanced yogi, who can and does leave his body every now and then, and can function independently of it in a routine manner, it is just like a dwelling house. The very idea of identifying oneself with the body will appear absurd to him. It will be seen, therefore, that practice of yoga is the most effective means of destroying Asmitā completely and permanently. As the yogi leaves one vehicle of consciousness after another in samadhi, he destroys progressively the tendency to identify himself with those vehicles, and with the destruction of Asmitā in this manner, the veil of Avidya automatically becomes thinner. Okay, I'm going to stop there for now, and we will do Sutra 7 in the next video, but let me read it for you. That attraction which accompanies pleasure is raga. Remember raga and devesha, attraction and aversion, right? That attraction which accompanies pleasure is raga. All right. We're really getting somewhere now, aren't we? Thank you for joining me today. Until next time.